All right, so thank you everyone for being here. As Sun said, this is an introduction to aviation English, and this is actually the first of 5 webinars that we're going to be doing for you throughout the next several months, really leading up until the TESOL conference. The purpose of my webinar today is really to teach you a little bit about aviation English and set a foundation for the upcoming 4 more webinars that you'll see in the coming months. So as Sun said, my name is Jennifer Roberts, and I am part of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment. But before we go much further, just to reiterate here, this is a webinar series that's part of 2 interest sections from TESOL. So this is a collaboration between the English for Specific Purposes interest section, which is what I'm representing, and the Applied Linguistics interest section that is represented by Sun. We're both the current chairs of those 2 interest sections. It's also a collaboration with the International Civil Aviation English Association, or ICAO. So just a little bit about me. My name is Jennifer Roberts, and I'm currently the curriculum chair for the Department of Aviation English at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University Worldwide. And I'm really proud to be part of this department because, as far as I know, we are the only academic department inside of a university that is completely dedicated to aviation English. And we didn't start out like that. It's been a long road that we've climbed, but we are now officially a department, and we are really proud of that. I have a master's in applied linguistics from Georgia State. I'm equally as proud to be representing Georgia State here today. I'm working on my master's in human factors from Embry-Riddle. I am a board member of IKEA, and as I said, the current chair for TESOL's ESP interest section. I've been an English teacher for about 12 years. And about 7 of those years I've been devoted to aviation English, and that is pretty much coinciding with the time that I've been at Embry-Riddle since 2015. And all of these experiences have really shaped kind of what I'm going to talk to you about today. And I want to warn you that I'm going to talk to you today about a lot and in a little bit of time. So try to keep with me. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. Usually when I talk about aviation English to TESOL professionals, they find it really interesting and they find it to be something that they haven't really thought about before. So I'm eager to hear your questions and eager to teach you a little bit about this. So let's get started. So easiest question here is, what is aviation English? We may not really think about this too often, but I imagine that most people on this webinar have taken an international flight. And the truth is that in the background, there's a lot going on that enables us to take a flight from Rio de Janeiro to see the Taj Mahal in Agra. There's probably going to be a layover. You're probably going to have to stop at some airport along the way. You're going to cross over a lot of different airspaces. And you might say, how is that happening? Well, that's actually happening because behind the scenes, there's English language communication occurring between pilots, between air traffic controllers, between ground staff, between maintenance technicians, all over the world. I would argue that English is probably the most global of all the industries in the world. And we might take it for granted that we can fly across the world, but there's a whole system of cooperation, of coordination, and especially of communication that makes this possible. And sometimes we only think about those pilots and those controllers. But before we go much further, I want to challenge us to think a little bit about where language impacts aviation safety. Sometimes we put the pilots at the center of the equation. And I am starting here with a picture of 2 pilots. Actually, these pilots are not flying an aircraft at the moment, but I wanted a picture with 2 women pilots. So that's why I chose this one. And yes, absolutely, pilot communication is important. And usually we think about pilots as communicating with air traffic controllers. So this is a picture of an air traffic control tower. Air traffic control also happens outside of towers, right? So there's a lot of communication between pilots and air traffic controllers in English, of course, but there's more, right? So pilots also have to communicate with each other, right? So these days, more and more flight decks are becoming multinational, multicultural. So that means you can have a captain from Brazil working with a first officer from China. And those 2 people, they have to communicate with each other. This kind of crew communication also is happening in English as a second or foreign language. In addition, pilots communicate with other pilots in the sky. They also work with very complicated Manuals published by organizations like Boeing, right? Boeing is an American company. Boeing publishes materials in English. It's actually not really the best idea to try to translate these kinds of materials. It's risky, it's a lot of technical language, it's also expensive. Also, can we feasibly translate these things into all the languages of the world? No, we cannot, right? So pilots are interacting with these kinds of things in English as well. We also have new services like Data Link, right? Data Link is kind of like a text messaging system between pilots and air traffic controllers. You can see with these manuals and this data link that we're now also introducing another skill. We're not just talking about speaking and listening, we're now talking about reading and writing. Pilots also communicate with people on the ground to get their flight plans, working with dispatch. They also work with maintenance, right? Maintenance English is becoming a much more popular kind of noticed area. There's a lot of people doing research on this these days, but if you think about these maintenance technicians, they're also working with these very technical, complex manuals about how to maintain, repair aircraft. Again, published by companies like Boeing, right? So published in English. And then if you think too, let's imagine the flight goes to China. There is a problem with the aircraft and there needs to be maintenance done in China. At some point, the pilot is going to want to communicate with those maintenance technicians to find out what's happened to the aircraft. That communication is going to happen in English. Pilots also, of course, communicate with cabin crew who communicate with passengers. Pilots make announcements to passengers. And then there's another area, which is flight training, right? Flight training is something we've worked with a lot at Embry-Riddle because we teach a lot of pilots. And this is a different domain. So this is a domain of students needing to learn how to become pilots, but they're still using English as a second language. I really like this graphic. It was created originally by one of my mentors, Elizabeth Matthews, and I think it shows us that we often just think about pilots and controllers, but in fact, there's a lot more communication in English happening in the aviation world, and all of this communication does in fact impact safety. Unfortunately, one of the ways that we can illustrate how language can impact safety is through investigation of accidents. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about an accident that happened about 30 years ago. Unfortunately, it was a fatal accident. As you can see there, 73 people were killed. There was an aircraft flying from Bogota to New York, and essentially the aircraft ran out of fuel while it was on approach to JFK. The aircraft was in 3 different holding patterns and basically, ran out of fuel, crashed, and unfortunately 73 people were killed. So what happened? These are some quotes from a New York Times article. I'm just going to read these with you. So twice in these moments, the crew told controllers that they were running low on fuel, but they did not declare an emergency, nor did they object to their newly assigned route. Did you tell them we have an emergency? The pilot asked his co-pilot, who was handling communications with the controllers. I told them we're low on fuel, he answered. Okay, so 2 things to pay attention to here highlighted in blue. Number 1, that there was no declaration of an emergency. And number 2, what was communicated here is that they were low on fuel. So let's look at what exactly was said. So starting up there in the top left, you see the captain actually speaking in Spanish to his first officer. Tell him that we are in an emergency. Okay, now we see the first officer to the air traffic control there in green, not telling him that we are in an emergency, but rather saying we're running out of fuel. The captain asks him again, what did he say, right? I told you to tell him we are in an emergency. What did he say? You can see there what the first officer said to the captain. I already told him that we intend to try again, right? Not about the emergency. The captain reiterates, tell him that we are in an emergency. First officer says, yes, sir, I already told him. So we can see here that in fact he did not tell him. There may be some power distance at play here, some cultural implications, but regardless, captain's saying, tell him we are in an emergency. First officer's not actually doing that communication. One important thing to note here, though, is that the captain is not speaking English, right? The captain is communicating in Spanish to the first officer. And so the first officer is sort of the middle person here, needing to communicate what the captain said to the air traffic controller because the first officer can speak English. You see the ATC there in the blue on the kind of bottom right responding, is that fine with you and your fuel, right? And the first officer saying, I guess so, thank you very much. but in fact, it was not fine with the fuel. They were running out, or maybe at this point, even completely out of fuel. The ATC gives another instruction, Avianca 52, climb, maintain 3000. And now the first officer is saying, negative, sir, we just running out of fuel. Yeah, we just running out of fuel. Let's think a little bit about what that means. We just running out of fuel. So in English, just actually has a lot of meanings. You can use just to say that something occurred right before. You can use just to say it's a small amount of something. You can also use just to emphasize a point, or you can use just to kind of minimize or make something less serious, right? That's why we say things like, I'm just kidding. So in this context, he says, we just running out of fuel. Well, we can see that the grammar is already not correct, right? But what meaning was this first officer trying to express? Was he trying to say, we are just running out of fuel, right? Making this fact kind of less serious. It's okay. It's happening now, but it's just us running out of fuel. We're going to be able to make it. Or did he actually need to say that we have just run out of fuel? Right? It has already happened. We do not have any more fuel. We cannot comply with your what you're asking us to do. So the air traffic controller, based on the structure that the first officer was using, would not have been able to know exactly what the first officer was trying to express. Unfortunately, I believe that the first officer was looking to say, we have just run out of fuel, but that was not communicated, and unfortunately the aircraft did crash. So this kind of communication between a pilot and an air traffic controller, this is called radio telephony. Radio telephony is essentially communication over the radio telephone. And it's not easy to understand at all, right? I am definitely of the belief that there are no native speakers of this kind of language. Even if you speak English as a native language, when you are trying to listen and communicate in this language, you can't do it unless you've been taught how to do it, unless you've learned how to do it. And just to kind of illustrate that point for you, I'm going to play you a short clip. And while I'm doing that, feel free to type in the chat if you want to about any of these questions, if you feel like you can answer any of these questions. I'm not going to correct you. It's not a quiz, but if you want to give it a try, go ahead. So let's listen and see if you can understand this language.
Tower, good evening. Emirates 5 Kilo Papa Super 13 left.
Emirates 5 Kilo Papa Super, good evening. 4 miles in total of 737 with runway 12 left, that's land.
Land 13 left, visual Emirates 5 Kilo Papa.
Emirates 5 Kilo Papa, low altitude, check the altitude, change the altimeter 3043.
3043, Emirates 5 Kilo Papa.
Emirates 5 Kilo Papa, you appear to be extremely low in the approach. You do have the runway in sight. Emirates 5 Kilo Papa, I assume you're not continuing the approach. You can fly heading 09 or 0, maintain 2000.
Heading 09 or 0, 2000, Emirates 5 Kilo Papa.
Emirates 5 Kilo Papa, traffic 1 o'clock, 3 miles, please helicopter 1,000 feet, has in sight.
Visual Emirates 5 Kilo Papa.
Emirates 5 Kilo Papa, fly heading 110.
Heading 110, Emirates 5 Kilo Papa.
Emirates 5 Kilo Papa, contact 1257 for receipt.
1257, Emirates 5 Kilo Papa.
Okay, so you may or may not have been able, I'm not going to look at the chat right now, but you may or may not have been able to tell, yes, we're talking about Emirates. What is the runway? You might have heard runway 13 left. The problem is there's definitely a problem with the altimeter. I'm not going to look at this completely for you, but I just wanted to illustrate for you what this kind of communication sounds like. So it's not easy, right? And what you're actually hearing here is two different kinds of communication. In radio telephony, I mean, there's definitely some research about this kind of language. We may evolve this definition further, but essentially what we're looking at is two different kind of areas, registers, if you will, of radio telephony. On the left, you see standardized phraseology. So these are it's a set of terms and phrases, which includes specific rules about pronunciation and syntax, and it's quite different from natural language. So you heard that in the recording when the pilot said tower, good evening, Emirates 5 Kilo Papa Super 13 left, right? And the controller says Emirates 5 Kilo Papa Super, good evening, 4 miles ahead, 737, wind 140 at 10, runway 13 left, cleared to land, right? So those are not complete sentences, right? They're missing a lot of markers for grammar, things like that. But, in radio telephony language, they understand what this means. This is in contrast to what we call aeronautical plain language. And this is used when phraseology does not suffice. Okay, so there is a prescribed set of phraseology, but there are a lot of different situations in which we will need to communicate. So when phraseology is not enough, we switch over to plain language. You heard this when the controller said, Emirates 5 Kilo Papa, you seem to be extremely low on the approach. Do you have the runway in sight? So now you can see things like you seem to be, right? We're using hedging. You can see complete sentences like, do you have the runway in sight? And the truth is that radio telephony is actually a mix of both of these things. There's a lot of code switching that goes on. There are a lot of times we hear plain language when perhaps phraseology could have been used. So you can see this language is complicated, and we actually need a lot more research into this register of English to fully understand what's going on. Now, this radio telephony, it is governed and regulated by ICAO. ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. It's a UN agency formed in 1944. There are 192 member states in the world. And what they do is publish annexes to the convention containing standards and recommended practices. Standards are things that are necessary to aviation safety. Recommended practices are things that are desirable for aviation safety. Where our field, Aviation English, comes into play are really in these two annexes. In aeronautical telecommunications, that's where you'll find information about phraseology and the communication. And then in personnel licensing, right? That's how we're going to look at what level of English do these people actually need to be certified to be safe in this international flight environment. Well, in order to do that, we needed the ICAO Language Proficiency Requirements, the LPRs. These came about from a 1998 proposal from India after a terrible mid-air collision that resulted in 349 fatalities. ICAO Assembly Resolution A3216 was proposed by India to take a look at what is the proficiency level of pilots and controllers to conduct and comprehend radio communications. The Price Study Group was formed at that time, and in 2003, Document 9835 was published, the edition 1, the manual on the implementation of the language proficiency requirements. They set a deadline for 2008 for all pilots and controllers to have reached compliance, but they needed to extend that, published Document 9835 edition 2, and in 2011, we had the final deadline for compliance with the LPRs. So, what are the LPRs, right? And how do we determine if someone meets the language proficiency requirements? Well, how we do that is through the ICAO rating scale. The rating scale is for assessing, very specifically assessing, the speaking and listening proficiency of pilots and air traffic controllers using radio telephony. Okay, it's very important that that definition is clear. That is all that it is for. Speaking and listening proficiency for pilots and controllers using radio telephony. There are 6 skill areas of language performance in which the rating scale is used. Okay, so you see them there: structure, pronunciation, vocabulary, comprehension, fluency, and interaction. And the minimum level for international operations is ICAO Operational Level 4. This is level 4 of 6 different levels. So I'll just show you here the descriptors for level 4. You can see again those 6 skills. They're in bolded black. You can kind of see the language point, what's being evaluated there. And then in blue, it kind of shows you that, there's some room for error, there's some room for miscommunication, but it does not prevent effective communication. It's limited, rarely interferes with meeting, deals adequately. You can see some of this language that's in the operational level 4 band. There in the bottom left, there's a note to you that test takers receive a final rating that's based on their lowest score of the 6 skills. So you can get a level 4 across the board, but if you get a single level 3 in vocabulary, for example, then your final rating will be a level 3. So all throughout the 2 annexes that I mentioned, mainly Annex 1 and Annex 10, there are language standards and recommended practices from ICAO that have to do with English and with what we do. The one that we're really focused on is really there in Annex 1, where it requires that pilots and controllers demonstrate at least ICAO operational level 4, right? Like what we just talked about. But what you might notice here is that there aren't really standards and recommended practices about how we do that, right? So how should a pilot or a controller demonstrate that they're at ICAO level 4, right? I think this is still our main question here in this aviation English world. So, by nature of what we know, if we say that they need to demonstrate level 4, that pretty much means they need to be assessed, they need to take a test, and they need to demonstrate that they're at this level of proficiency. What we hope for, the objective of all of this, is really that we can find a universal standard that we can implement globally, regardless of what test is used. So the way this works, and people are usually surprised about this in the TESOL applied linguistics community, but individual member states, that means different countries in the world, they are individually responsible for identifying or developing their own ICAO LPR assessment and endorsing it for their state. This extends to airlines, civil aviation authorities, that's like the United States FAA, air navigation service providers, that's who works with air traffic controllers. So they can build their own test, they can develop their own test, or they might choose to use a commercially provided test. But it is up to the member state. So that means that what's happening in Egypt and what's happening in Argentina could be very different, right? The assessment that they're using to determine if their pilots and controllers demonstrate ICAO operational level 4 could look very, very different. What we really need is a common test framework, and we need to have equivalents in these different ICAO levels that are awarded, and of course in what's associated, what is assessed in those tests. As far as I know, there are no other examples of an attempt to develop and implement a common language standard internationally, where different tests are used independently, but they are based on a common rating scale and a set of associated descriptors. This is language from IKEA. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But right, so what we're attempting to do here is we have the rating scale, we have these descriptors, they come from ICAO, but how that is assessed with what test is again up to the member state. So you can already see that what this has resulted in is differences in testing standards and practices. There may be a lack of confidence or even mistrust in the ICAO levels awarded due to this discrepancy in testing practices and standards. And it could even have a negative impact on language training programs or just attitudes towards the LPRs in general. Unfortunately, these challenges could, in fact, undermine the long-term effectiveness of the LPRs and compromise aviation safety. So you may say, well, what do we do about that? What's the solution? Well, one solution that we are working on with IKEA is the test design guidelines. And these guidelines are meant to provide a framework for developing LPR tests and to really help these member states, these CAAs, to kind of understand these issues and make the best decisions that they can about the testing practices that they use with their pilots and controllers. Just a quick plug here, if you're interested, especially in this, I would encourage you to go ahead and put on your calendar for webinar number 4 of this series, where Michael Kay, the current president of IKEA, will speak a little bit about these test design guidelines. Okay, moving forward. So testing is not the only area that we need work in aviation English. This is a pyramid, again, created by one of my mentors, Elizabeth Matthews, but I love this pyramid. I've always loved it. I think that it helps really visualize all the things that we need in aviation English. So ICAO, of course, created a policy. The ICAO is at the top of this pyramid, but this has been a very top-down process. So I would say that the policy was created without the infrastructure that was needed to support the policy. But that does not mean that we didn't need the policy first. I think that having the policy has definitely helped us. It has helped us be able to have the window and the space to fill in this pyramid. So now there are regulations. We cannot undermine the importance of that, but we need to build the infrastructure to support that regulation. So let's just take a look at some of these areas, and we're going to start with research. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I will say that there is a lot of research that needs to be done in this field. For example, I think we need to look at the language needs of these non-radio telephony contexts. You know, how much do we understand about these different registers, right? How much do we really understand about the language of maintenance manuals? I don't know if Anne Lamperis is on the call with us today, but she's definitely a champion of maintenance English. And I think that's a huge area that needs more research so we can understand those language needs, right? And in these different areas, you know, what do the assessments look like? We can't just have a one aviation English assessment and that's it for all of these different areas. Do we need more regulations, right? And what should these regulations look like? Some of these areas are not as regulated or even regulated at all compared to what we do for pilot and air traffic controller radio telephony. If you remember back to what I said about the LPRs are only for pilot and air traffic controller radio telephony communications, speaking and listening, right? So we're not even looking at their ability to read these manuals, for example. And that's not even to go into the other areas of aviation English like flight training, maintenance, cabin crew, etc. Curriculum and test efficacy, right? Are our programs working, right? And what is the right approach for aviation English? What is the right pedagogical approach? Are the tests that we are using effective? I think we need more research into what we're doing now and to see whether or not it's working. Another area I'm really interested in is intercultural communication and interactions and how these might be affecting flight safety. Just to show you an example here is a helpful chart, right, that shows cross-cultural interactions for aviation personnel. So there on the left, you can see all kinds of people that are working in aviation. And then there in the middle column, how they might be interacting with other people or even artifacts that come from a different culture, right? And then at the far right, you're seeing the ways that these two interfaces might interact. So things that we might not even think about, like regulations or legal frameworks. You know, what is the effect of those coming from one country, but those needing to affect, or you need to work with people from other countries? I think cross-cultural communication and interaction is definitely an area we need more research in aviation. Moving forward, this is my personal favorite area, teaching and learning materials. We need a lot of teaching and learning materials. And why do I say that? Well, if you go back to this diagram, right, you're thinking about all these different ways that language affects safety, the ways that we use English in the aviation context. And I would argue that all of these courses are needed and that all of these courses look different, right? So the course that we build for English for air traffic controllers does not look like the course that we build for maintenance technicians. And even beyond that, brand new maintenance technicians do not need the same course as technicians who have been working for 20 years, but just need to improve their English, right? So I would argue that we need to build courses for all of these areas. I am not of the train of thought that aviation English is a one-size-fits-all. I think that we need tailored courses, tailored curriculum for each of these different areas because they have different language needs. We also need to think about how we can do these things in the classroom on the ground. And of course, since the pandemic and even before the pandemic, learning how to do this effectively online. Aviation is particularly interested in online education because of the way that the scheduling works for these students, right? They're working air traffic controllers, for example, they work with really crazy shifts and it's not easy to get them all in the classroom, right? Especially for the amount of time that we know it takes to develop language proficiency. Of course, though, this is challenging. Aviation English is, of course, an area of ESP, English for specific purposes, and we know that ESP should be founded on needs analysis. I would say we need needs analysis in all of these areas. That takes time, that takes investment, but we're getting there. Moving on, training programs. I'm not going to go into this one too deeply, but the same way that we accredit our IEPs, I believe that in the future we need to accredit these aviation English training programs. Let's talk a little bit about instructors, right? Some of us are teachers. I'm sure a lot of us on this call are teachers. What does an aviation English teacher look like, right? Who is an aviation English teacher? So this document 9835 published this appendix. This is a recommendation of aviation language qualifications for a teacher. So you see we have best practice, very good, and minimum. So just to give you an example of me, when I started at Embry-Riddle, yes, I had a master's degree, right? I had a master's degree and a very good education from Georgia State. Language training experience, I could put myself here. I had language training experiences in accredited universities and language schools. I had been a teacher for about 8 years or so. Can't remember, my math is incorrect, but 7 or 8 years. Aviation communications, can't say I had any of that, but maybe I had the ability to work with an SME. I've always thought I was pretty good at working with other people. I may not have had the ability to work with SMEs. SME is a subject matter expert. So what that means is working with an actual pilot or an actual air traffic controller, someone who's an expert in that area. Yes, I had experience developing materials using a communicative approach, and I had some program administration. I'm highlighting both sides there because I didn't have a ton, but I had a little bit. So yes, I had academic credentials, teaching experience, curriculum development, program administration, but what about this one, right? I didn't really have any aviation familiarity. I happen to have grown up in an Air Force family, so I had a little bit, but I certainly did not have enough. Okay, so how do we get that and why do we need that? Why do aviation English teachers need to understand aviation? Well, again, aviation English is a form of ESP, and we cannot understand what we need to teach without understanding the context. In fact, this would be irresponsible and unproductive to work to try to improve the job performance of a job that we do not understand. Okay, so we need to make sure that we enable our instructors to have the ability to develop this kind of competencies. Not saying we have to become a pilot or become an air traffic controller, but we need to understand this context. That's one of the things that makes aviation English unique. Just to show you how this is so badly needed, I happen to be the manager for the social media of ICAO, the International Civil Aviation English Organization. And these are screenshots of actual messages that I've gotten in the ICAO messaging service, Facebook Messenger. You can see here what they're asking for. They're asking for a way to become a certified aviation English teacher. That they want to find a course that meets ICAO requirements, looking for an accredited course. Well, I'm here to tell you that none of that exists. Okay, so there is no ICAO certified aviation English teacher. There is no accredited course from ICAO. So I have to tell you, yeah, if anyone is making that claim, it's false, right? ICAO has a policy, but again, the infrastructure beneath that policy is not regulated by ICAO. That is not to say that we do not need that. I'm also of the belief that if we could have an aviation English credentialing system, a course, a set of courses that makes sure that aviation English teachers or teachers like us coming from TESOL applied linguistics backgrounds, that we can receive the kind of training and education and credentialing that we need to become an aviation English teacher, and that there is a way to certify that. I definitely believe that that would be useful. I think that's something that we need. There are people that are working on that right now, and I think that would make a huge difference in the future of aviation English. But at the moment, we don't have that. We've already talked a little bit about testing, about rating, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but of course we also need that. This is a whole pyramid of infrastructure. We've talked about kind of the discrepancies, the differences in testing practices and rating practices across the world. Again, we are working towards solutions for that, but we need a lot more work. And why is this so important? Well, aviation English is important because it's high stakes. It is safety critical, right? Language may affect situations that are already really stressful, time-sensitive situations, particularly in radio telephony contexts. And as we know, small misunderstandings or miscommunications can have fatal consequences. Accidents are never caused by only one factor. There's always a chain of events that leads up to it, but we have to think about the role that language can play, either in causing misunderstandings or maybe in the ability to resolve something. If you think back to that Avianca 052 accident, that word just that word just, what was the effect of that on the air traffic controller, and ultimately on the actions that were taken on the part of both the pilot and the controller, that ultimately led to the accident. It is high impact, right? So a poor curriculum or an instructor, may affect a student's ability to work or to progress through training, right? So a lot of people in this world, their work and their livelihood actually depends on maintaining that ICAO level 4 or reaching that ICAO level 4, to provide them with jobs and stability. So it has a high impact on people's lives. And we need to remember that students may participate in our courses and our training while maintaining full-time jobs. And what that means is that they're maintaining aviation operations. They're actually responsible for the flight operations of potentially a whole country. We work currently a lot with the country of Brazil, and our students are full-time air traffic controllers working in Brazil. And so for that reason, we need to make sure that our courses are as effective as possible and that they're as efficiently designed and delivered as we can do, because we cannot waste their time. Their jobs are quite literally very important, to their country and to aviation operations. So once more, I'm just going back to this pyramid to emphasize to you, my TESOL and applied linguistics colleagues, friends, that we really need people like you to join us in this industry, because we need to fill all of these different areas of this pyramid, and we need cooperation with the aviation industry as well. We need partnerships, we need investment with these different airlines, these different ANSPs, to make this happen, because at the end of the day, aviation English deserves quality, and it deserves quality for safety. Before I go, I want to remind you that we are going to actually have 5 different webinars. I have just almost completed webinar number 1, and we're going to have 4 more coming soon. These are the dates that you see there on the left. These are not completely confirmed, but I would say 95% confirmed. We'll only change them if we have to. And there in the bottom left, I just put a QR code. If you're interested in IKEA or learning more about what IKEA does, feel free to go to that IKEA website. The QR code will take you to the website, or to definitely follow us on LinkedIn or Facebook, to learn about other kinds of opportunities to become more involved in aviation English, or certainly if you're just looking for a place to learn a little bit more, this is a place to start. And in the meantime, I just wanted to plug one quick event. This is the JEA seminar. It comes from Brazil. In the bottom right, there's another QR code. This is a free event. It's happening online, as you can see, from October 17th to 21st. There will be different presentations released daily from some of the leaders in aviation English. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in this and you can't wait for our 4 upcoming webinars, this is an opportunity for you to do something in the meantime. It is free and it is highly recommended. And last, this is my contact information. So I'm always happy to talk about this with pretty much anyone at any time. It's my favorite thing to talk about. So if you're interested or want to learn more, please just get in touch. And thank you very much for coming to this webinar.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We have a couple of questions that I can see now in the chat box, and a lot of questions about the qualification and certification, being aviation English instructor and teacher. Let's see. So Deidre posted questions: is aviation English instructor training available at the Egg Riddle remotely or in class?
So at the moment, we don't have any courses that we provide, I guess, externally. We hire people internally, and then we do put people through about a 12-week training program. But at the moment, we don't have that kind of available to to the public, if that makes sense. But I do think that we need more and more courses like that. You know, there are courses like that. Is it Deidre who asked that? Deidre? Hi, Deidre. There are courses like that that exist in the world, but you know, not at the moment from Embry-Riddle. But that's something I would like us to do in the future.
It looks like another question is kind of related to that one. What about companies like Mayflower College and Nile English courses which train teachers to teach aviation English? Are these not sufficient?
No, I'm not saying they're not sufficient. I don't know the content of those courses. I know the Nile course is taught by Neil Bullock, who is someone that I highly respect, and I definitely think his course is probably amazing. I haven't taken it, but really the problem here is more that there's no standard for what needs to be done to become an aviation English teacher. So there are certainly options for you to build your credentials, to build your portfolio, but what we really need is a standard across the board of what is expected for you to become an aviation English teacher. Right now, if it's just kind of picking and choosing from all the things that are available, that's fine because that's what we have available, but we truly need more of a standard so that everyone's on the same page about what's required. Anne, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, and just
I need to unmute. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we should also take into consideration that there are operational professionals who also want to be English teachers. So what English do they need? So there's a two-way kind of training that needs to be taken into consideration. They bring all the operational knowledge, background, experience, but there is a skill to being an English teacher as well. So there needs to be a two-way kind of approach, depending on the background that someone brings in. Are you an English, you have your English speaking credentials and you need the aviation familiarity, or do you have the aviation familiarity down pat and you need the English teacher?
Right. Yeah, I agree, Anne. And I think if you think back to that chart that comes from ICAO, maybe there are, I don't know, less than 5 people in the world who actually have all of those, best qualifications. Yeah. Best qualifications from ICAO say that you need a master's degree in applied linguistics TESOL, and you also need to be a pilot or an air traffic controller. So I don't know very many people like that. I know a few, and they're amazing. Sometimes I call them like the unicorns of aviation English. But until we all have the ability to get our pilot's license, I think, Anne, you're right. And there needs to be a path in both directions. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Anne. I think that your comments kind of address one of the questions that raised. Another questions raised by Barack. I think it's related to some of the fairness issues. And so you mentioned test takers receive a final rating based on the lowest score of the 6 skills, such as interaction. But native English speakers are not subject to tests and sometimes may not adhere to best practices such as standard phraseology. Non-native English speakers greatly struggle with the radio communication. So in the context, the question was, are we training our pilots and ATC pertaining to how to minimize communication breakdowns today?
Yeah, that is a good point. That is something that's also getting a lot more attention these days, is what are we actually doing for native English speakers? The rating scale is meant to apply to native English speakers as well, but there's a lot of times when being a native English speaker, I would say falsely equates to being a level 6, and that is not true. So as I said, I am also on the train of thought that there are no native speakers of aviation English. There are no native speakers of radio telephony. So your first language does not automatically mean you're going to be skilled in this, from the bat. I don't know what the chat was like when I was playing the radio communications, but I imagine that a lot of us were not able to understand exactly what they were talking about. So there's some good research that's happening out there. Whoever asked that question, Dominique Estival, is someone who's doing a lot of work looking at native English speakers and what we need to actually be doing for them. What kind of training do they need, and what kind of assessments do they need as well? I definitely believe that the burden should not all fall on the non-native English speaker. I think there's a lot that native English speakers can learn about communicating in this context with non-native English speakers, accommodation strategies, just generally how to do this communication. And we're not there yet, but we're working towards that. And that's a very good point. Was it from Barack? That's a very good point, Barack.
Okay, one question by Eva. So how can one get a foreign student training to be a pilot to take a ESP or Aviation English with a knowledgeable ESL instructor outside their regular flight training?
Like, how can we convince them to do that?
I think so. I think that was the questions.
Well,
Yeah.
so flight training is a whole different domain of aviation English. Flight training, I would say you need they think they don't need it. Yeah. So how can we convince them? So I would say one thing that has worked for us is finding ways to integrate the English language training into the practical training, the flight training. So I think when we separate them out, then aviation English starts to become kind of like a gatekeeping course. It becomes kind of like a barrier for students who actually just want to become pilots. So if you can find a way to make the English language training part of the flight training, I think this is a really effective strategy. This is something that we've tried to do at Embry-Riddle is kind of combine the two so that it's not looked at as you have to get through all this English language stuff before you can start flying. But rather, if we can integrate the two, then, students feel a little more, I guess, convinced that this is worthwhile. But I think that goes down to course design, how the organization also treats it. A lot of the burden, I guess I would say, or the need is going to fall onto the flight training organization, the airline, the ANSP, for how it's presented to the students as this is something that you need.
One question is about, is there any different paths to be military aviation English?
I don't know a lot about military aviation English, but I will say that Moon Young Park, he will do his webinar about military aviation English. I think he's going to be the 5th person in our webinar series. So I would say maybe save your questions for him and attend that webinar.
Okay. So I think that's it. If you have any other questions, you could mute and voice your questions if you want.
It's Linda Weiland, Jennifer. Fantastic presentation. I do have one question. You talk about getting more education in it. Do you think those schools that teach air traffic control as their major or as a minor could benefit from an aviation English course? Because I heard a lot of interest in getting from this presentation today from you and from the participants on how important this topic is.
You mean like students who are going to become air traffic controllers, Linda?
It doesn't have to be someone that becomes an air traffic controller in my book. I think it could be a pilot, a mech, or anybody, like a general, what is aviation English? A lot of what you presented right now just really piqued my interest on, do my students that are taking a bachelor's of science in aeronautics, could they benefit from a course, and would the place be in the aviation or air traffic control minor?
Yes. So absolutely. I think 100% yes. I think that all students, everyone who's going to work in the aviation industry would benefit from having a course that teaches us about language in aviation, language as a human factor in aviation, how communication is used. I think that even if you're not going to be an aviation English teacher, right, just having that awareness, being able to advocate for that is so valuable. In fact, at Daytona Beach campus, we have a course. It's called Language as a Human Factor in Aviation, developed by Elizabeth Matthews and taught, every semester. And Linda, I'd like to get that course in worldwide, so maybe we can look at that. But I think 100% that anyone that's going into the aviation industry could benefit from learning more about this area. I think it could make a tremendous difference.
Great, thanks. I'm going to be emailing you later because you really piqued my interest. Thank you so much.
Linda's my colleague at Embry-Riddle, everyone. So yeah, go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I think just as a follow-on to that point, the more we can bring in the different positions, pilots and ATCs have had a lot of attention, but I think we also need to have case studies and examples and research that comes also from aviation maintenance technicians, but also cabin crew, and even other areas where there could be confusion. We need to do the research. What areas might we be missing?
Yeah.
And really that this introductory course could give people a sensitivity to the breadth of where the language factors come into play.
Yeah.
So I think it needs to be broadened as specifically as an intro course. And I think it would have a great deal of, it could be designed to have a great deal of impact so that people who hadn't thought about, gee, we should be doing research. Gee, we should be looking at this particular area of curriculum development. Gee, we should be really looking at how we can improve testing. That whole, this wonderful pyramid, that whole range needs to be presented to people across the professional positions.
Yeah, I agree, Anne. And I think even, areas like accident investigation, for example. So there are a lot of, people who go to school and they want to be accident investigators. Well, do accident investigators know how to look at an accident and look at the transcripts and see what was said and think about how language might have communicated or might have impacted the accident, So I think anyone that works in any area of aviation can benefit from that. You're right, Anne.
Yeah.
Trevor, do you have a question?
Comment?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I actually used to work for British Aerospace, working with the Saudi military in Riyadh, and I was teaching aviation fundamental English. And what we were doing there, very much to the point that Jennifer and other people were speaking here, was to provide students with the fundamental English skills to be able to transfer them on to their ATC controllers, to their WISO operators, to people who will teach them aviation, more specialized aviation English. And without that general framework of English or language training prior to that, students were really struggling because, again, as you said exactly before, the instructors who taught the specific courses like navigation, like weapon systems operations, were people who were native speakers coming from England, Canada, South Africa, other countries who did not speak Arabic. And without these students having their fundamentals, they would be at a loss with these instructors because these instructors didn't have any language teaching ability.
Yeah, that is also a good point. I mean, I think that's part of what we have worked with at Embry-Riddle is that we have a lot of students who are coming to us to learn how to fly. They're coming to learn how to get these aviation operational skills. And sometimes they come without the adequate, English language proficiency, like you're talking about, that fundamental kind of background. And that presents problems. That presents problems in how long it can take to get through some of that other training. And at the end of the day, are they being certified correctly, adequately, accurately? We don't completely know. So I think, yeah, we can't undermine the importance of coming into aviation English, which is a very specialized type of training with that fundamental kind of foundational English language knowledge. And I would like to say that doesn't mean, I think, that we can't provide aviation English from the beginning. So something that I've worked a lot with is figuring out, you can take a student who I came from an IEP background, someone who was in that level 1, right? But maybe we're not teaching them radio communications in that level 1 kind of English language instruction, but we can still start to teach them about aviation. And that is not, I am not saying that aviation English should always be this content-based approach, but I think that content-based in this scenario can be really effective. So we're kind of going ahead and teaching them about some of these aviation pieces of